Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survive Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and with me, of course, is my co-host, Caleb. Caleb, how are you tonight?
Doing really good.
Excellent. That makes two of us. Well, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Good night, everyone.
See you later. We're back again to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and, of course, how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to our old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. So, Caleb, we have a pretty fun guest today. Tell the audience, who are we talking to?
Yeah, somebody who checked a couple of the boxes for us, right? It was involved in a 90s youth group. Although very different, not ours, 90s youth group, but was involved in 90s youth group. And then ended up taking over and leading the Five Oaks youth group. His name was Tim. He was the youth pastor who succeeded. That's the right word, right? Succeeded John, the youth pastor both you and I grew up under at Five Oaks. And we say it in the episode, sometime in 2005, I want to say. That doesn't sound right. I don't know. Sometime in the 2000s.
Don't let the audience know that we don't listen to anything after it's recorded. We just
Research.
Throw it out there.
Research.
Whoops. No, I believe it was 0203, somewhere in there. Obviously, as we listen to the episode here, you'll get that date down. But I do, you and I were gone. I was in college for sure, and may have already been graduated and popping in and out of Five Oaks from time to time. However, I do remember that John leaving as youth pastor was a big deal because, as you'll find out in the episode, Tim does talk about how much drive and how much ambition John had for us and for the group itself. And so by the time John left, it was really kind of at its peak, and Tim had some big shoes to fill, and he admits that. So it was really fun going through that journey with him.
It's not the total other side, but it's a little bit of the other side. It's a little bit behind the curtain. It's a little bit of that just different perspective it was pretty unique to hear kind of his, the way he saw that youth group, because he was involved before he took over. He kind of had come into the church as an adult, as a young married adult. And I don't know, I thought it was really interesting to kind of just hear his perspective on that it feels like an outsider perspective, and then it feels like an authority figure perspective. Not that Tim's a very authoritative. He oozes
authoritarianism.
My lead guy, but yeah.
I think of Tim as somebody who transitioned during kind of an important time. So he took over youth group as it was, graduating from the 90s, let's say. But also by the time he left, it was also really graduating from another era, and we talk about how kids in the group have similar connections but are different.
Yeah.
Of course, it's going to happen all the time as things progress and change. But in reality, was it like to, have one foot in the pre-cell phone, pre-technology era, and then also have to lead kids and youths during that time when it's pretty brand new?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a new, unique era. He's in the internet era, but not the cell phone era. I mean, it's kind of that bridges that gap where now we're full on in both.
I will always appreciate Tim's positivity. For those of you who know Tim, of course, you'll know exactly what I'm saying, but it was refreshing to just kind of get that right away from him. You feel it right away that he's just a happy, positive guy, and he's assumes everyone's best intentions and wants to find your best intentions in all your conversations. So that was a refreshing part of the conversation for me, was to remember how positive he is.
Honestly, I think it's another guest of ours that I'd maybe met him once or twice before this, because again, we've highlighted, I was 2002. I think I was living overseas actually if that was around the time that he was involved. So,
well, Tim, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate the time you spent with us. He is an hour ahead, so we kept him up late on a weekday night. So, Tim, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for listening, and we hope you enjoy.
Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show.
Tim, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's fantastic to see you again. It's, again, been far too long. How are you?
I'm really good. It's been really long. I don't even know how long, but it's super cool that we get a chance to have a conversation and catch up a little bit.
Yes, thank you for agreeing to do this. I think the last time we may have seen or talked to each other, I was newly married or about to get married, and we were in a small group together.
Yes,
right?
like probably just around the time of your wedding, which my wife went to and I missed because I was home puking my guts out. That's what I remember.
Oh, I got married January 1st, so you must have had like a bug or something.
Yeah, yep. I was violently ill. What year?
2005.
Okay. Wow.
So
yeah, that's awesome.
So again, decades ago.
Yeah.
A long time ago. So yeah, we've known each other for a long time. And you, to be clear, Tim was not a youth in the youth group. Tim, tell us a little bit about your story, just kind of joining Five Oaks.
Yeah. The ironic thing is I was not, I survived youth group in the 90s. Not really, because I wasn't really in. I guess I graduated from high school in 1993, so I was in my own youth group, but not at Five Oaks. I came to Five Oaks as newlyweds. My wife and I had just gotten married maybe 6-7 months before, and the first couple months of the year 2000, so we missed the 90s, we came to Five Oaks. We moved to the Twin Cities. Somebody recommended a bunch of churches to us. The second one we visited was Five Oaks. And the thing they had said about it was great youth ministry. And we went and visited, and that's the last church we visited. We ended up sticking around there. And I got involved maybe 5-6 months later. Actually, my wife and I both did, as small group leaders in the youth group. Mm-hmm. And then eventually the church hired me, and I followed John as leading that youth group. So it's wild.
Yeah, we'll go over that definitely soon, because I'm always interested about that transition. But John was my youth pastor, Caleb's youth pastor.
Yeah.
And then I distinctly remember getting the news. Again, we can talk about it in a little bit, but both Caleb and I were gone, but then hearing that John was going to leave, it was like, there's no way. There's like, he's so foundational to the whole thing.
He was.
I'm sure it was kind of big shoes to fill, but we know that it would be in good hands. So that the comment you made there then about knowing it had good youth ministry, like, did you have kids at the time when you joined, or was that just on the horizon?
Yeah, barely on the horizon. We had really just been married, I think, 6 months. And so no, but it was we moved from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I was involved in the youth ministry there, just as a volunteer at a small church. So I just kind of knew, that's something I want to do at whatever church we land at.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, I know that they really appreciated you having kind of you were in the bullpen ready to go, so to speak, when John couldn't handle it anymore. Maybe a little bit of background, like what was your Christian upbringing? Did you grow up in what you would call a Christian home or not? Or like and then how that translated as to, graduating in 93, like what was faith like for you as a high schooler?
Yeah. I grew up in definitely a Christian household. My dad was a pastor. Both my grandfathers were pastors. A couple of my great-grandfathers were pastors. It was like a weird, almost like this is the family business or something in a weird way, but it's good. But so I grew up in a Christian household, went to church, and going to church was normal. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night youth group. Once I hit 7th grade, but when I was growing up, I don't know, youth groups I think like hit another gear sometime in the 90s.
Yeah.
I loved my youth pastor growing up, but things were very simple, and I think that was normal. I think after a few years we started maybe having some worship songs on a Wednesday night, but it was pretty simple. And so I didn't feel like I knew, like coming into like at Five Oaks, I didn't feel like I really knew like how what seemed like a really robust, multi-layered youth ministry like Five Oaks had. That was kind of new to me. For me as a high schooler, I was a good kid. I followed the rules. I had a brother 2 years ahead of me at my high school. I knew if I got into trouble or crossed any Christian boundaries, it would get back to my parents. So I was a moral high schooler. But I think I just sort of thought like, okay, I've accepted Christ. I'm going to go to heaven when I die. It'd be great if I could sin less. So try to sin as little as possible. And when you do, make sure nobody finds out about it. That's kind of what I would describe a lot of my faith was as a high schooler.
Sure, giving it your best shot.
Yeah, give it your best shot, and especially don't let anybody find out when you mess up.
Especially your bro.
Especially your bro, your parents, your youth pastor, And I went to a Christian college, had no intention of ever being a pastor. In fact, was against it for two reasons. One, I thought, just because it's the family tradition, that's a really dumb reason to do this. My friends would ask me, of course, because they knew I was a church kid, and a lot of my friends weren't. They didn't go to church, and so they would ask me, and I'd be like, no, I'm not going to be a pastor, because one, it's dumb to do it. It's tradition, and two, people bothered. I just was like, people are always calling our house, and it just seems like a big hassle. So I don't want to do that. But during my senior year of college, some light bulbs started to go off, and I started to wonder if maybe, I just looked at some of the experiences I'd had in my life, and I was like, oh man, I wonder if maybe God is preparing me for some kind of church pastoral ministry, maybe, but didn't really do anything about it. I graduated from college in 97, and then ended up at Five Oaks. I was working for the state government, for the state of Minnesota, and in 2002, I guess, the church, John actually approached me about coming on staff, and it was kind of like, that was like, okay, that was the final, like, okay, I think this is what God's calling me to, and I'll go for it. And I jumped in really green, really like, I don't know how to be a youth pastor, and John was instrumental in like just walking alongside me as I learned to do that. But that's a little bit about how that happened.
That's amazing. I think it's really cool that you were kind of like, well, maybe not, and just maybe let it happen, and God guide you to that spot. So it was 2002, which makes a little bit of sense because, like Caleb said, he, left, and after high school, I kind of left too, but I wasn't that far away. I was like,
you were around.
I was like 45 minutes ish away at college.
Yeah.
But I lived there. I didn't live at home. So like I would pop in and out, which is obviously how we got to know each other in summer, right? We ended up in your small group that you were leading.
Right.
So we knew
but I
each
can
other.
even remember having a conversation with you maybe in my first year doing it, my first year on staff, and you were you were probably still in college.
I graduated college 2002, so we were
okay. It was maybe just when you finished.
Yeah, I was hanging around.
Yeah, and I can remember having you, like you were telling me a little bit about your experience in the youth group and some of the things you did. Anyways, I can remember that. It was very early on in my time there.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I'm curious then, like as an introduction to what the youth group meant to Five Oaks, like how did John describe us? Or the group, not us, but the group itself? Like was he like, you better be ready for, a huge challenge, naughty kids, or like, what, maybe more so like, did he describe what it meant to the church itself?
Well, I got some of that from Henry too, who was the senior pastor, still is. So we started attending. I started volunteering. I was leading 8th grade boys. They were insane.
Mm-hmm. God bless you, Tim.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Henry Michael. And it was the guys in his class. And it was wild. And we were meeting at Lake Middle School or Lake Junior High, and like doing small group in between the lockers on a Sunday morning, and they're just chucking stuff over the lockers. So it was already, I had a taste of the mayhem for a couple of years before it became my job. What I knew was, one, this guy who had told us about Five Oaks, who didn't go there, mentioned it had such a strong youth group. He worked for the denomination, and that's how he knew about Five Oaks. So I knew that. Henry told me the story of, like, I got here and there was this youth group that was bigger than the church. And like I had to find some other things like that John could work on because like he clearly had time and energy. John was I think he's way more driven than I am. And so you mentioned Scott. Oh, you had big shoes to fill. I did, so I knew. I came in and I just saw, like, okay, these guys do. You've talked about in some of your episodes some of these just horrible games that were done, just puke worthy, kinds of things. So I knew that John, again, he was driven and he had a high bar. Like, this is another thing I knew. He had a high bar for student leaders.
Yes.
And that was something that was very evident to me. I was like, this is a youth group that is way beyond the church kids. So when I showed up, that was very obvious. Like, this goes way beyond the kids whose families come to this church. So those were the things that stood out to me. It wasn't like a youth ministry I had seen before. And I'll be honest, it's not like I knew a ton of youth ministries up close at the time. I knew my experience. I knew the church I'd been at in Sioux Falls. But that Five Oaks group, especially those first couple of years before I was on staff, I was really like, this is a different kind of thing. As I've listened to your podcast, I'm like, Caleb and Scott, I don't know how much you're aware of this. I don't think you had a totally unique experience, but you didn't. But it's not like it was one of a kind. But coming in as an outsider and walking in there in early 2000, it was pretty unique, I think. Yeah.
I think you're right about that, and that's why we were so excited to talk to you, to get kind of that outside perspective, just completely, no history with it, right?
Yeah.
So
I heard stories from the get-go. Oh, Scott Teese broke John's windshield. He jumped on it. I don't remember what it was, but like I knew that story. Right. The armpit sandwich crap.
I forgot about that.
I never saw it, but I heard about it,
Yeah.
Those things, those were some of my first impressions.
Get ready.
Yeah.
No, you mentioned the student leader thing too, because that's come up in multiple episodes. And I think I think all good youth groups probably try to identify some student leaders, but there were a lot that continually went through that group and were prepared and were trained and given an opportunity to lead different parts of the youth group. I've jokingly said on some episodes, like, we were doing John's job for him. That obviously wasn't the case. He was doing quite a bit. But, I was junior high youth group leader for a couple of years while I was in high school. Like, he and other leaders of the church identified those of us who had some qualities and might be able to serve in a way and give us a taste for ministry, right? Yeah. And I know that he was like, well, you should go to Northwestern or Wheaton or something, check out ministry, and I just ended up not doing that. But a lot of kids were very early on were identified with qualities that could help out the church, and I think it's good to have kids serve in capacity like that.
Yeah. The way that kind of that emphasis on student leadership and getting students involved stuck with me. It's definitely it ended up changing and morphing over the years that I was there. I was on staff at Five Oaks for 12 or 13 years, something like that. So it was a long time, and obviously a lot changed over those years. Like, for example, when I started, student leadership would meet like at 7:15 a.m. before the first service. I did that, dude. Like my first year, and I was like, this is nuts.
Wait a sec. Those kids got out of it?
This is the kind of thing, yes.
Come on, dude.
It was like, so for the first year and a half or something, I did that. And then I was like, we're all suffering. This is what I mean. Like, John had a level of intensity and drive that I didn't have. So I was like, let's do this Sunday afternoon. You know? Yeah, there were some things like that. And I ended up kind of shifting, you know, like kind of what the focus was for that student leadership group. But that idea of like identifying some students and saying, hey, okay, let's go all in. And that was, yeah, that thing that you guys had going when I showed up was very influential on me.
That's a funny comment that you make. Of course, I know Bill and other people have made comments about like John had those high standards and like maybe they were there to like break us down and build us back up, like a little militaristic about it. I'm like, I just think he wanted to get the most out of our time, right? You know, and if we had to be at church at 7 a.m. on a Sunday, we probably weren't up very late Saturday evening, but you know, Caleb and I probably were. We just pulled all night or something like that. So
yeah,
you know, there's one, you know, it doesn't always have to be that intense all the time, but based on kind of what you just said, what are some other things that just kind of evolved? Because when you came in, obviously it was a very established, very well-run machine, and then you had to fill those shoes of driving that bus. Yeah. So what are some things that just kind of over time in your 12, 13 years as youth pastor evolved and changed?
Some of it was like, okay, it was super helpful that when I first started, John, Henry, the senior pastor, they were like, okay, don't change anything the first year. Just, you don't need to and you're not allowed to. And that was really freeing and really helpful. Just like, you know, kind of run the things that are in place. So that was helpful. But I'm, you know, some of it's like I'm wired differently. Times were changing. All those things play into that. And so with times, things started to change. Like, there were, I don't know what it was like when you guys were there, but when I first was coming around, it was like 7th and 8th graders on Sunday night, 9th and 10th graders on Wednesday earlier, then 11th and 12th graders later. So it was like 3 different groups going on. And so that was one thing, is like after that first year and a half or something, I combined 9th through 12th. It had its pros and its cons. You know, so there were some structural things like that. Another thing, like in that student leadership realm, I moved from having, I kind of leaned into having like, okay, these high schoolers are going to help make these things happen. They're going to lead games. They're going to come up with ideas. They're going to, you know, they're going to help run this ministry. The thing I ran into is I found that like it was hard for them to have friends who weren't involved in the ministry. Because they were so involved in it. And if they did, and they invited them to come on a Wednesday night, they couldn't hang out with them because they had all these jobs they had to do.
Sure.
So this was after quite a while. You know, this is probably 5-6 years into it. I started to shift towards like, okay, how do you influence, like how do you live out your faith, not just on a Wednesday night? And that wasn't what was happening before, but like, let's use this student leadership thing to focus specifically on what's happening not on Wednesday with your friends at school. Yeah, bring them here and we want to get them connected here, but that's not the only way that they might encounter Jesus. It's not the only way that they might encounter other people who are following Jesus. So that became a little bit of a shift. Is like, I mean, we used, you know, disciple making language, and okay, how do you, like as a high schooler, you can be part of helping making disciples of Jesus, even outside the walls of the church. So that became, that's kind of like, especially that student leadership piece. That's where we started to shift after several years, and I think some of that just was like the culture of our country, especially in the North. I live in the Bible Belt now. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, but it was becoming less common as we went through the 2000s to be involved in a church, to be involved in a youth group as a high schooler.
Right.
And so there was a little bit of a need, I felt like, to sort of at least be open to decentralizing that a little bit. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you know, you saw, as far as I understand, just continued upward trajectory of that youth group, right? So as time went on, you probably had to corral things even more. And some of the things that we've talked about with some of the people you've already listened to, the Jackies, the Bills, their kids are in it now, right? Yeah. And yeah, talk about feeling old. But what experience are they having? And it seems like just, I think naturally probably, that kind of the larger the operation, the less opportunity there is to hang out. And of course now with their phones and social media and everything, they're not forced to hang out. But we always go back to like back in the day, like as we were talking about before we started recording, Bill, Mike, Caleb, and I, we were tight. We did everything together. Like when you were a youth pastor, did you see those kids doing like everything together, like all the time?
There were like clusters like that. I think as the group grew, the church was growing and that youth group was growing. And so it was those largely, not exclusively, but largely those student leadership, really involved students who I still saw that with, I mean, it was a tight group. I can remember being on a missions trip in New Orleans, and they're all discussing like, they're all intertwined to the point where I literally couldn't keep track of who was in whose family. Like I would get so confused, like who are siblings and who just is always at each other's houses. It was super. It was just, they were like making plans of who's gonna marry each other one day or something like that. And I'm like, wait, can you marry that? Oh yeah, no, okay, you're not the same family. It was like it was hard to track. So there was definitely some of that, but as the group got bigger and the church was bigger, it wasn't. There were more people who were. You'd have a lot more who were involved, but maybe it wasn't quite the center of their social universe. I can remember you guys talking on an episode about how there was a time when all the students sat together on a Sunday, and made it this huge block. But as we went to, more services, Saturday night service, 2 or 3, Sunday morning, I don't know. It was like, well, we can't have all the students come to one service because then all their families will come to that service, and there'll be nobody in this other service, So you start to go like, we didn't like. I don't think anybody ever intentionally broke up that all sitting together, but things like that started to fade, and that's part of why I think you guys were part of a really unique moment.
Yeah,
that was really cool because Five Oaks was still such a young church. And it had such a vibrant, a vibrant student ministry, and it was a cool time for you guys to be there.
I think we had that. We were in that moment, lucky to be in that moment, I should say. You graduated in high school from '93, Caleb '97, me '98, and you mentioned earlier like youth group was changing. You got and when you found Five Oaks, like. It was much different than what you had experienced. Yes. And I think just looking back a little historically, like I think those 90s, there was a huge ramp up of like, okay, this is going to be part of culture. Families want it. You had started having the Christian music scene explode, all these different things where, all of a sudden you could kind of coalesce around not only the faith part of it, but the culture part of it.
Yeah.
And then you add John, who was super sharp about identifying the right kids to help lead, going after kids and intentional about his relationship with them to bring them in, letting them know wherever you're at, you can come here, that sort of thing. I think there was a good combo there because John understood that moment.
Yeah, it was like there were youth pastors in the 80s. There were kind of youth pastors in the 70s. My dad was a pastor, so he was his first couple of years, like the early 70s. I mean, like he had books that he passed on to me of like youth group games from a book published in like 1970. And I'm telling you, it was the same stuff. It was like in 1970, someone came up with the idea, let's have games that will trick high schoolers into almost making out with each other. Those weird games that became like, you talked on one episode, Caleb, I think somebody talked about this game where you like are passing a spoon in through your clothes.
Yeah.
It was like somebody decided in the 70s, really, like, I don't know if it came out of Young Life or where it was, but it was like, okay, let's play a game where you put a toothpick in your mouth with a lifesaver on it, and you have to pass it to the next person who has a toothpick in their mouth. You like to get your lips as close to each other as we possibly can.
Yeah.
It was like this thing started, and so those youth ministries existed in the, I think, 70s and 80s, but it was like in the 90s, youth pastors really became specialists, Scott, at what you're talking about, at like, okay, this isn't just going to be a one-night event. We're going to create a culture around this. This is going to be, we want this to be kind of the center of the social world for high schoolers, for them to be really engaged way beyond just a Wednesday night. And I think John was the right guy in the right moment and really created I think a really cool culture and environment. I mean, like a really good thing, you know? I mean, nothing's perfect, but a really good thing.
General consensus, of course, we haven't talked to too many people yet who would disagree, and if there are people, that's perfectly fine. But general consensus was, you know, pretty welcoming and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, you know, nothing nefarious behind the scenes or anything like that. Yeah. But Caleb, I think we had talked about in one of our earlier episodes about youth ministry becoming a college degree. And you go to salsa and you go to get training for that, right? Early on, whereas maybe in the 70s and 80s, the head pastor was doing all of it. The churches weren't as big, or it was a volunteer, something to that effect, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, and even the church I'm at today, there is definitely a youth pastor. Youth group's a little smaller just because it's focused on U of M students in terms of ministry. Those people don't have kids, of course, but there's a youth group to be sure, but it's very volunteer heavy, very volunteer heavy that way.
I think the other thing that's unique is like kind of how student leadership was happening. So like you talk about student leadership, when I know now, because Brant talked about that, spoiler for or promo for an episode coming up, or maybe it's already happened. I don't know the schedule. But Brant mentioned that like kids playing in a band. Did you transition to having a band? Because that's, I think that's a very unique difference. Because the church I go to, the student leaders get promoted to the band, and that's where all the student leadership happens. And I do think that's a different dynamic than having them help with games, which they do some of the emceeing. There's some of the kids who do that, but that's just a different feeling than showing up at 7 a.m. at Perkins on Sunday morning to talk about whatever else it was. And so like, I'm wondering do you know when Five Oaks transitioned, or was that not a thing for you still? Because you weren't in a building for at least part of that, which also was a hindrance. That's why you couldn't do a band on Wednesday nights, because you didn't have a building to meet in. That changes the dynamic. So
when we combined those groups, a year and a half into it or something like that, combined those two high school groups, so we put 9 through 12 together, we had a couple of really good high school musicians. And so we started a band, a worship band on Wednesday nights. But it was separate. It wasn't student leadership. So those were two separate things. So we still did student leadership. We still met Sunday mornings and then eventually Sunday afternoons. And that was one group. And there might be some overlap. But then there was another group that was, these guys are playing in the band on Wednesday nights. And some of them, especially in that first group, some of them were like, yep, I'm here because I want to follow Jesus, and this is a way I can serve. And some of them were like friends with those guys and just great guitarists. And they liked being there, and they liked the people. And so it was like, well, this isn't like a student leadership thing, but this is another way to be involved. So that's kind of the way I viewed it. So we did like introduce that band thing, and then it became a thing. That was, maybe 2005 or something. And it was part of it as long as I was there, at least with the high school group. But always those were kind of, that student leadership and that student band were two separate things.
I like that. Cool.
I haven't really talked with anybody about it ever, but that is something I've noticed. Even at the church I'm at now, it's not 100% that way, but it is sort of like that's what, sort of like an assumption that like, that's what leading is. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's I love, I mean, part of it for me was I love getting high schoolers serving in their church, honestly, not like, oh, so we have more people to get the work done. But when I went to college, it was so hard to get plugged into a church. I went to a Christian college in a Christian town in a lot of ways. I mean, it had so many churches, and it was still really hard to get plugged into a church. And I just realized if you know how to serve in kids ministry, or you can play in the band, or you can, well, then you at least can, I don't know anybody here, but I can do something while I'm here until I get to know somebody. So that's why that piece was important to me in my years. But again, a little different than that student leadership thing.
Well, now you are a pastor of discipleship. Did I get that right? In Knoxville?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So you transitioned away from youth ministry. Obviously, you're probably still doing some sort of support in that regard. Like, looking back on I'm going to say your youth group leadership experience, like, what do you remember fondly about that experience?
The sense of community among students who were like learning to follow Jesus together. That's what I would say was the thing that I loved. I never wanted to try and like falsely create like, hey, we're family, you know? I wanted that feeling. I wanted people to feel welcome, feel close. It's a John thing that you guys were involved in, was like, be really welcoming. Don't just hang out with your friends. Go and welcome people. So that really was good for me to see modeled, because I think we were able to continue some of that. Like I said, I didn't want it to be like fake, like, oh, we're just going to call ourselves one big family. But there were definitely times when it was genuinely there, I think. And like connections, like, hey, we're trying to follow Jesus and we trust each other and love each other. When those things happened, I just loved that. And honestly, listening to your podcast, the first episode I listened to was the episode with Bill. Listeners, if you haven't listened to it, go back and make sure you listen to the episode with Bill.
Start there. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Start there. That's where I started. I was overjoyed listening to it. I was filled with joy. I don't know how else to put it. It was like you guys were talking, more than 25 years after the fact. And I know not everybody had the experience that you guys had. And I know not everybody had that experience in the years I was leading. But when people did, that's what I loved. And to hear that, like, oh, you guys can still talk about that 25 years later, and it had an impact on you, not because everything was perfect, but I could hear it coming out of your mouths, like ways that you were shaped, and that ways that like God is still working in your life because of something that happened then or was started then, and the connections that you had with one another. That's like the most enjoyable thing in the world, really.
Well, it's a little bit of the fruit of your labor, right? And the hard work you put into just trying to connect the kids. We've mentioned it multiple times on episodes. Like, I'm still in awe of the people who help out. You know, I helped out for quite some time, and I don't do it right now. And at this point, feel a little guilty about that. Just drop my son off on Wednesdays and get out of there. But
I do too.
But it's like, you know, that everyone is some people are paid for that time, right? But a lot of those people are not.
Yes.
And just to see that change over time, how else are you going to know unless you hear someone tell their story? And, you know, I coach my son's travel baseball team. You know, we've been practicing together since January. It's late July, right? I've seen these kids every day, every week, multiple days a week for the last almost 8 months now. And all I can think about now with the season ending this weekend is, man, I hope when they're in high school, when they're after high school, maybe they're not hanging out, but they have that memory that they can reconnect with at some point, and they can go out there and support each other. But not only that, just kind of be the good kids that they are, you know, into the future. So, but how are we going to know until it happens?
Right. And you wonder, there's definitely times, whether it's coaching baseball or volunteering or leading a youth ministry, you wonder, like, does this matter? You know, you wonder that a lot. And so it's cool to be decades down the road and get to see that, yeah, some of it mattered. That's good.
Well, and another reason for this podcast was John would always tell us, and I'm sure you heard him say it too, is I don't care where you're at now, I care where you're at in 10 years, you know, and that's such a formative statement, and it's a little bit of an idyllic statement, but it's like, yeah, we know life is not going to end here at high school, and now it's 30 years later, so, you know.
As a volunteer, I was a volunteer leader, I used to be like, oh my goodness, this dude says this all the time. And like, I mean, like, it's like, I mean, you guys can quote it. I can quote it. And, but like 10 years into student ministry, I was like, he was a genius. Like, none of these kids remember anything unless you say it 1,000 times.
Yes. Yeah.
So he said it 1,000 times.
Yep.
That's a really good idea, you know?
And there's plenty of people like us, people that you mentored through youth group who will still have that as formative to them that they will never forget because of that investment in time.
I mean, heck, it's the premise for this show in a lot of ways is,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, that's, I think when Scott started talking about it 3 years ago, he was like, I have this thought, and yes, this is a lot about the reconnection, but it was like, he kept on saying that. So we should do that. We should have a whole podcast where you can just listen and, you know, do a checklist of, well, here, I wanted to care about where you're at 25 years later. Here you go. We're just going to broadcast it for you, John, and you can, you can see if it work.
It's our ode to him. Yeah, that's what
but it is. I mean, it is very much the premise for that idea of it's not just about now, it's about later. And I still would argue that I think even kids who don't want to have anything to do with church anymore, I bet you still a lot of them would see those as there's some still formative moments in there. And you know, there's some kids who obviously it's, you know, things have happened, right? Life happened and
there's some pain
hurt
too.
and all those things. But I bet you there's a lot of kids who still look back and go, yeah, you know, I mean, there's moments there that just that still stick with me, even if I don't go to church on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I'm thankful for those kinds of things because I have regrets too, you know? I mean, like, I didn't know, there's so much I didn't know. And, you know, I was, even as a 27, 28-year-old, when I started on staff, I was insecure and I wanted to, you know, to do a good job. But you end up, you know, it's easy to be focused on yourself instead of students at times. And I was an extrovert, and I just think about like the things I did with introverts, you know, like if the kid wants to just sit quietly, let him sit.
Leave him
quietly,
alone. Leave him alone.
You know, leave him alone. I just like, you know. So I was thankful I wasn't the only one leading, you know. That's why some of those volunteer leaders were so good because they weren't wired like me. But sometimes I think about the things I know, like I got wrong, and that's just reality. And so I'm glad that they're, you know, I just go, okay, I believe God was working through all that, was still able to do good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In spite of pushing an introvert to, you know, join a game they didn't want to play, talk, or make a friend,
talk
as the introvert in the room, just having to talk. That's enough, people.
That's right. On that note, you know, now talking about the way things have changed till now, you're still in ministry. I'm sure you see quite a bit happening with the youth ministry in your current church. Like, what are some things that are different? Are there different challenges, or are the challenges the same? Are there different? Are the kids basically the same? You know, trying to reach them is the same. You got to go down the same avenues, or is that changed? Like, what's different about youth ministry now?
Yeah, I moved to the Bible Belt, and I think that in itself was a shift. But I feel like maybe a few years later, doing youth ministry here in the South is like it was maybe 8 or 9 years ago in the North, you know, in the Twin Cities or someplace like that, where it's a little less like post-COVID, certainly here, and probably more so in a place like the cities. It's even less a normal thing to be a part of a church or to be part of a youth group. I think we've definitely noticed that at our church. So that's like, it's culturally a little bit different. Certainly the things that make it different working with teenagers in any context, at a high school as a teacher. Some of those things apply at the church. I mean, like, there just is a different level of distraction and isolation, like sort of social isolation. All the stats just show that, like teenagers spend less time outside of their house with other people than they did 15 years ago. And I think that impacts how a youth ministry works. Like, it's not even like, they have, like, I felt like when I was in youth ministry, they've got more stuff competing that they might go and be a part of. Sports, band, theater, whatever, they've got all these. Now it's not, some of that's still there, but it's also like they're just literally not going to do as many things outside of the house as they did 15 years ago. So it's just, I think it requires maybe a different expectation and a different kind of engagement. Like, how do we help students still be vulnerable with each other, still care for each other, still get to know each other, but maybe with fewer hours spent together, And that's hard to replace. Like, as you guys know from your own experience, those hours together they do something that almost nothing else can do. And I don't know I think I think those kinds of relationships are a good thing for, not just for a youth ministry, but for teenagers who go like, okay, I want to maybe live differently, and I want to try and go the way of Jesus. It's good to have those deep relationships. You need them, and they're just I think harder to foster now. And I don't have the answer for it.
Well, nuts, because we thought you did. But
well, I'm deleting this episode.
No one will listen to this. No, I think that when we've talked to people, that's kind of the resounding difference. Mike's kids go to the church now and stuff, and there's not as much one-on-one time. I see my own son, right? He doesn't need to connect person to person. And when we say that our time with our friends in youth group felt like years and years and years, but in reality it was maybe like with a Bill, like 18 months, maybe 2 years at that. It was because that time spent together didn't feel like hours or days. It felt like months. It felt like years, because it was just constant, and you just didn't keep track of time there. So, watching the social aspect of youth group change is fascinating to me, because it's not like it is, and my son does have leaders in his youth group that he can reach out to and text if he needs to and that sort of thing. But also, like, he's not really interacting with those kids on a consistent basis like we were.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely see that.
Is there anything, you kind of mentioned, like pushing an extrovert or an introvert into a situation they didn't want to be in? Like, is there anything you look back on and you're just like, dude, why did we do that? It doesn't need to be cringy or bad or anything, but it's just, something you look back and like, that was, what did we choose to do something like that?
Okay, I can tell you a couple things. One, putting 20 high schoolers into the back of, I'm not joking, putting 20 high schoolers into the back of an unmarked van that we flagged down on the side of the road outside of Tijuana, Mexico. That's something I looked back on. I was like, I don't think I should have done that.
Everyone's fine.
Like, everyone's fine. Clear. Such a nice guy. Wouldn't let me give him the $20 I tried to give him for giving us a ride. But it was like, that wasn't a good idea. Anything that made students throw up, and unfortunately there were multiple things. Anything that resulted in a student throwing up, We once, Chubby Bunny was overdone by the time I came around.
Sure.
It's like, we got to do something different. Yeah. So we played the song Roxanne by the Police. Borderline church appropriate, but
sure.
If I just was assuming high schoolers didn't know what it was. We played Roxanne, and every time he says Roxanne, you got to put another marshmallow in your mouth. Listen to the song with that in mind. When they get to the first chorus, it's just mayhem, Like, that was a terrible idea, because then a kid throws up, Thankfully he didn't choke to death, but it's that kind of, anytime a student, eating cheese from in between somebody else's toes, who wants to eat Cheetos?
Yeah.
Cheese toes.
Oh my God.
That kind of stuff, it was like, there was this sense of, well, we'll try anything. Maybe we shouldn't have.
We've talked about in the past, like, just the sheer audacity of some of these things to get kids' attention. Like, I can't think of any other realm in which those things are either done or asked for or necessary, eating cheese from toes, and so there was this level of just like, we gotta wow them, we gotta just make them laugh, we gotta make them cringe, and in all the good ways, that sort of thing. Does that still go on? Like, is that still something, the way the youth groups operate? Do they still need to be that zany?
That's a good question. I would say it changed during my time.
Oh.
A pendulum swing and culture reacts, and I think that it was like, I don't know if students became sort of jaded or cynical towards those things. I don't think that was it. I think like middle schoolers were still totally happy to go for it. But there was a sense of like, I feel like almost collectively in youth groups, youth pastors across the country were starting to go like, we want people to have fun, but we don't want it just to. And I think at Five Oaks, it never was just that craziness, but it was like, maybe we want to put our efforts somewhere else. I don't know. So even in my time, I felt like that started to shift, and that really got toned down a lot. Probably maybe 5 years into it for me. By 2010, it was probably that had changed a lot. And I think it continues that way. As I look at the high school ministry, at least at the church I'm at now. Middle school, yes. But high school has gone like, middle schoolers are still all for it. But high schoolers, it's like, it's not, we're too cool for that. But there definitely has been a shift away from like that madness that was there for a long time of like, we'll do anything, we'll make it as gross and hilarious and outrageous. That has definitely toned down in general, at least.
That's interesting that you say that, because I would think some of it middle school, it does kind of make sense, but I wonder, just kids got access on their phones, they can see anything, they've seen the crazy stuff, right? If you're
you can't do anything as crazy. That's definitely part of it, I think.
So you can't like wow me or whatever. Maybe doing it in person is a little bit different, but still they've seen it. Caleb, didn't we talk about a youth leader playbook, right? And like what pages are they drawn from the playbook?
Yeah, I thought about that. The idea that, because one of the revelations that I've had in the last couple of years is that we were not the only people doing Carmen human videos, and I know that's come up on a lot of episodes, but like we thought we were so unique, and that everybody did. I've run into so many people now online who are like, oh yeah, we did those. And so like, yeah, there is that playbook, and it feels like that playbook maybe changed a little. And it's like, and I have thoughts too about like, is it that the youth pastor job changed? Like the rise of celebrity pastor made pastor too cool, so he doesn't want to get too silly. I mean, I don't know, like, but you're right, it does feel like there's this shift. But yes, I think there was a playbook, and there probably still is. It's just a different playbook now.
Totally. I mean, there are some literal playbooks, that you could, like there's publishers who like, they make books for youth pastors, and a lot of them, but there also is, I said even, I think that emphasis on like just the crazy, wild, zany games seemed to fade, I think, across the country, like, because there was, in a sense, a playbook, and I think there still is. Like, I don't know if it's just youth pastors talk to each other, somebody sees a video of somebody's, well, first it was Carmen, then it was Lifehouse. Like somebody sees on YouTube, and then they're like, oh, we got to do that, or some kid in their group says we got to do that, and it spreads. The playbook is real.
Well, will always be fascinated how this changes over time, and it's really good and fun to hear your experience of just kind of being part of that leadership and watching it change and having some ability to put your hand on the scales and try and direct it in some way, but kind of letting it take a life of its own too. So you've spent a lot of time with us tonight. Thank you very much for recording. My last question Now, I usually ask, what's the zaniest, grossest thing you ever did? But we kind of already talked about that, so I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction. Okay. And I'm just going to ask, there are people who I know will be excited to hear that we got to talk to you. Like, for those kids that were in your youth group at the time, what would you say to them now? And you can say, whatever you'd like. It can be, you really gave me a headache or you caused me to go to therapy, or is it just like, what would you want to say to them now in terms of where you hope they're at and where you hope their faith is, how their faith is working for them?
A couple things I'd say. One, if they wonder, like, especially for the ones who that was a significant part of their life, if they wonder, like, oh, was that just significant for me? Was that just because I was in high school? Those were amazing years of my life, as an adult leader, pastor. Like, I would hate for somebody as an adult to look back and go, oh, it's just a thing that, like, it's a machine. A church is a machine, and they have a youth pastor, and they got to have kids show up. And it did not feel that way for me. And I think for the volunteers I worked with, it really mattered to us as adults. And we hoped that we were having an influence on those students, but they really had an influence on us. When I left Five Oaks, somebody made a book. They went back and got students from the very beginning of my years there and just said, hey, if you'll write something. It's one of my most treasured possessions. Just little notes that they jotted down, when they found out I was leaving. So I'd want them to know that. I guess the other thing is just, like, I'm thankful that I'm not the model of, like, I'm not the model. Jesus is the model, like, don't, like, whatever you had in high school, go beyond that, like, whatever, it was good in high school, and that faith in those high school years is good, and what you experienced and what a youth group could kind of build into you is a really good thing. But Jesus is like, there's so much more. And I would just hope that if somebody, like, had a great experience but was like, nothing's been the same since then, it's great that it hasn't been the same. But I really believe there's just always deeper to go with Jesus. There's always more to learn from him, discover with him, because it's as good as a youth group is, it's not the thing, And I'm so grateful for those years, but I hope that every student who went through when I was there finds more in Jesus than what they had there. I hope it was just a starting point.
That's great. Beautiful. Well, hey, Tim, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And best of luck for you out there in Knoxville. So
thanks, you guys. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for doing this. And thanks for not just being cynical about it. I think that's the easiest thing to do, and nothing's perfect. But I feel like you really just want to have the conversation, and what comes out of it. And I think it's really cool. So thanks for doing it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, we want to thank Tim for joining us. It was so great to have him on the show. Clearly an important part of the Five Oaks history, and it was just great to talk to him. Just a great guy, and great to hear kind of his perspective on the youth group experience that was going on at Five Oaks. Let us know what you thought about this show or any of our other shows. You can find us on Twitter at the handle @SurvivedYG. You can also email us at ISurvivedYouthGroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, let us know. You can find us at either of those two places. You didn't necessarily have to attend our youth group, but if you have your own youth group experience from the 90s or the 2000s, we'd love to connect and learn more and hear more about your story. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. I've had a couple different formats on the show, but it's just an opportunity to sit down and talk about some of the music that I've documented on my calendar and celebrate particular albums. Once again, that's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.